Hello, everyone. I'm Ricky Ranko-Browning, the president of UPA, and happy you could join us today. Up today, we are excited to be joined by Rob Jennings, who is the vice president of natural gas markets at API, who's going to discuss the role and impact of U.S. LNG and talk about the administration's U.S. natural gas export ban and some of the implications. Just before we jump into the sort of climate, energy, geopolitical, national security benefits of American natural gas, I want to share a few reminders of our upcoming events. So first off, a sincere thank you to everyone that joined us for our UPA Stroke of Luck charity golf mixer earlier this month at Topgolf. We had a great turnout. We had great fun at the event as well. Just a reminder, all of the proceeds from this event are going to be bundled with our next upcoming event and going to the Thompson House of Hope, which is a Uinta Basin faith-based men's drug and alcohol addiction recovery residence. So again, coupled with our Topgolf event coming up on June 12th and 13th already, we have our UPA fly fishing outing together with our friends at the Utah Mining Association. Again, this is a full charity event. All of the proceeds go to the Thompson House of Hope. So you're welcome to invite elected officials, members of boards that you might work with, other clients. Use this as an opportunity to really grow and develop those strategic relationships. Non-members are welcome as long as they are together with an invited guest or with a member. We still have, it looks like, 1 or 2 teams available on each day on the 12th and the 13th. So you can go to our website and get registered today. And then coming up on August 8th, we will have our oil and gas classic golf tournament at Soldier Hollow and at Wasatch State Park. So 2 separate venues. And new this year, we're going to be expanding to both the mountain and the lake course at Wasatch. So silver and gold as well at Soldier Hollow like usual. We're also going to be rolling out a cool new scoring app that's going to have some new and expanded promotional and branding opportunities for sponsors. This is going to be our largest event of the year. We're expecting around 600 participants. Registration is already open and foursomes and holes are filling up. So don't delay in registering and claiming your spot, and look for more information coming very soon on the new app and the related branding and sponsorship opportunities that we'll have available for folks. Then just a quick reminder that our UPA Basin Shootout will be September 10th in Mighton at the Pleasant Valley Hunting Preserve, as with previous years. And also in conjunction with that, starting in October, we will kick out our Shootout Hunger Food Drive. So look for some information soon, and we look forward to breaking our record year over year, which we've done every year for the last 4 years, to help fill the Basin's food pantry. So start planning for this fall. And then last but not least, I want to remind everyone about next month's Lunch and Learn. So on June 25th, we'll be back here And we're going to be welcoming Teresa Sauer from Beatty and Wozniak. She will be joining us to give an overview of a number of different BLM rules, how they work together to impact your development, and some tips for operators to consider as they work through leasing, bonding, and permitting in this new BLM landscape. But with that, let's get right into our discussion today. And we're going to talk about the role and value of U.S. natural gas. There's a lot to unpack here. So it's my pleasure to introduce back again Mr. John Ekstrom, UPA's communications lead, who's going to introduce our speaker and moderate today's event. John, take it away.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Ricky. And I hope you all had a pleasant and restful long weekend. Here we are back at it, talking about United States liquefied natural gas, or liquid natural gas. And joining us is Rob Jennings. He is Vice President of Natural Gas Markets at American Petroleum Institute. He leads API's efforts on natural gas and LNG issues, as well as emerging technologies, including hydrogen, renewable natural gas, certified natural gas, and carbon capture and sequestration. So what we'll talk about today is, amid global uncertainty, U.S. LNG has played a key role in stabilizing markets and displacing higher-emitting fuels around the world. However, short-sighted policies threaten the well-established economic, climate, and energy security benefits of our industry. We will be taking questions throughout this. You don't need to hold them to the end. So if Rob says something that grabs your attention and you'd like further clarification, or you'd like to dive a little bit deeper on a subject, I will have my eye on the YouTube chat. So please just drop it in there. And for now, let's welcome Rob Jennings. Rob, thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Ricky. Confirming everyone can see my slides. Happy to be here today to talk about LNG, one of my favorite topics. I know LNG has been in the headlines a lot over the past couple of years. It's something that maybe the average person didn't think too much about until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but has become just a really hot topic. And underscored the importance of our natural gas industry and how it feeds these LNG export terminals that really take natural gas around the world. So jumping right in, before we get into the permitting issues that we're facing, I wanted to level set a little bit about the industry because, again, I realize it's not something that everybody talks about every day. So the U.S. liquefied natural gas industry, as of 2023, the United States is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. We have 7 export terminals in the continental U.S., 5 of them along the Gulf Coast, 1 in Maryland, and then 1 in Georgia. We export about 14 billion cubic feet per day. That's about 14% of total natural gas production daily. So we produce about 100 billion cubic feet per day in the U.S. And export about 14 of that. But that being said, in addition to the 7 terminals that are currently online, we've got 5 more under construction that are coming online over the next 4 or 5 years. So by the late 2020s, our export capacity will have doubled, and all of those terminals are all the in development terminals are around the Gulf Coast area. So just one thing to note, I did mention the invasion of Ukraine. So historically, we have actually sent the majority of our liquefied natural gas to Asia, about 2/3 of it. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was, of course, accompanied by the cutoff of pipeline gas from Russia into Europe, a lot of our cargoes were redirected to Europe. And that's one of the unique aspects of the U.S. LNG industry, is that the cargoes are destination flexible and can go wherever the market needs them. So jumping right in, I think nothing quite underscored the value of energy security and having a strong domestic energy industry as much as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So as many of you know, in February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that coincided with the cutoff of a lot of the pipeline gas flows. So for years, Russia provided almost half of the natural gas consumed in Europe. Those pipeline flows were cut to zero. So what we're looking at here is a chart showing wholesale natural gas prices for 3 regions around the world. And we think about natural gas prices generally in terms of dollars per million BTU. It's just the standard metric for them. So what you can see here, we look back about 5 years, 4.5 years, and you can see for the first couple of years, natural gas prices around the world were really between $2 and $10. But as Russia began to cut off its pipeline flows of natural gas into Europe, prices started to drift upwards around the world. So we're looking at Europe and Asia, the blue and the red lines here. You can see when they began to build up their troops in February of 2022 when they actually invaded, and then later in the fall of 2022 when the big pipeline, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, was actually completely taken offline. You could just see how tight the global natural gas market got. And during this period, the United States, as I mentioned, really redirected a lot of the LNG cargoes to Europe. Europe was really on the cusp of not having enough fuel to keep the lights on, to keep industry running, et cetera. And our industry was really able to step up and supply our allies in Europe with needed energy during this extremely tumultuous period. And I do want to point out one other thing here. So just as prices in Europe ran up to $100 per MMBTU, and just for clarity's sake, for those of you who think better in terms of like oil, that's equivalent to $600 per barrel of oil. So 7 or 8 times what the prices are today. So really astronomical prices. But during that period, if you look now at the green line, that's where our wholesale prices for natural gas were. So well below $10 per MMBTU, despite the global turmoil. And really, this is a testament to the energy security benefits of having a strong domestic oil and natural gas industry. We're the largest consumer of natural gas in the world, but we're also the largest producer of it. And just having that sort of robust infrastructure and ability to produce all of the energy we need, you can see the benefits of that, the financial and economic benefits of that. So another way to look at this crisis is this is a map. This was a real-time look sometime in the middle of 2022, just showing all of the LNG cargoes leaving the U.S. Gulf Coast and heading straight over to Europe. So this is, again, is a testament to the strength of the industry, the ability of our industry to step up in our allies' times of need and send needed energy over to Europe. So in this case, we were sending about close to 10 billion cubic feet per day over to Europe. A lot of those cargoes, again, redirected from Asia, who had other options. And this really helped keep Europe afloat during the 2022 and 2023 time periods. And we continue today to send that much, not quite that much, but a significant portion of our LNG exports over to Europe. And again, this shift coincided with a pledge that the Biden administration made in the immediate aftermath of the invasion to, quote unquote, surge liquefied natural gas to Europe to help shore up its economy and make sure they had enough fuel to keep the lights on. So again, just another testament to the strength of the industry. But now to get a little more contemporary, to move into the permitting, the pause that we've been discussing for the past several months. So we're calling it the pause heard around the world because of the global nature of LNG. But
you know what, Doug? Before you go on, I want to expand a little bit on talking about Europe before we talk about why we're pausing some of this. And so the question I have for you is, in terms of Europe, you've seen Europe pledge to go net zero. You've seen Germany even get rid of some of its nuclear power. How much of the problem in Ukraine was just a tipping point for Europe versus what was happening before with some of their efforts to decarbonize, to transition to renewables? And what have the effects been since then?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Europe has very much been on the leading edge of the push to decarbonize their economy. They've done a lot in the power sector, brought on a lot of renewables. But the fact of the matter is they still use about 40 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas in the EU alone. And that doesn't count Turkey, that doesn't count the United Kingdom. And part of the reason for that is there are certain portions of the economy outside of the power sector that are harder to decarbonize. You can bring on renewables, and that will help you in the power sector. But just think of how big Germany's industrial economy is. I mean, car manufacturing, chemicals, glass, fertilizer, all of these things rely on natural gas. And it's been a bit more difficult to extricate natural gas and fully decarbonize those industries. So that's why you're still seeing some pretty resilient natural gas demand in Europe, despite these ambitious policies.
Understood. And has that caused a reckoning in their approach to the whole decarbonization? Have we seen any shift in that, or are they still thinking that they can get there with net zero or by decarbonizing?
Yeah, that's another good question. I actually think the answer might depend on who you ask. We talk about the EU as if it's one organism, but it's actually made up of like 27 member states. And I think some states have maybe pumped the brakes. Some nations have maybe pumped the brakes a bit and recognize, wow, this really did bring into focus how important a reliable supply of natural gas is. Whereas other states actually saw this as, no, this is a reason for us to get off of fossil fuels even faster. These are sometimes volatile global markets. We don't produce nearly as much natural gas as we consume. So we really need to put our foot on the accelerator, not on the brake, and accelerate our renewable plans, accelerate our carbon capture, our green hydrogen plans, so that we're no longer subject to these commodities that we import and the volatility that they can sometimes come with.
You know, that's an interesting point too. And one thing I want to tease out just a little bit is when it comes to commodities like oil and natural gas, you have to go where these resources actually exist. If they wanted to, how many of these countries actually have resources that they could extract and create their own supply if they wanted to? Some of them, I understand, probably don't, but how many of them actually do if they wanted to?
Yeah, we're blessed in the U.S. to have such a great resource base. I mean, we've got at least 100 years of gas left, at least, and that's based on the Potential Gas Committee's estimates. Not everybody is so lucky. The United Kingdom has good resources offshore. You've seen some talk about more investments in the North Sea, offshore production. I think the big swing point in the country that a lot of people were focused on in the aftermath of the invasion was the Netherlands, who used to be a significant producer of natural gas from the Groningen field in the northern part of the country. And one of the things that we were waiting to see was, the output from that field has slowly declined in recent years. That's been a regulatory outcome. The country decided that it wanted to shift its energy portfolio elsewhere. So they effectively regulated that production out of existence. And I believe as of October 1st of 2023, Groningen no longer produces any natural gas. So they're an example of a country that really did double down on this push to get off of natural gas here. So does that answer your question, John?
It very much does. And what has that done to the cost of their power as a result?
Yeah, it's, frankly, electricity prices in Europe are higher than they are in the US. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that their fuel prices, especially for natural gas, are higher than they are here. They also have, in some cases, they have higher taxes as well. But I think what we saw, if we were to go back and look at the line chart with natural gas prices, despite the calming that we've seen in the market since the invasion, natural gas prices in Europe still are trading about 4 or 5 times where they are in the US, and that does contribute to higher power prices over there. And there's a lot of concern over whether industry, manufacturers, et cetera, can remain competitive in the global market.
I think what you're seeing is there is some deindustrialization happening in both the United Kingdom and in Germany, and that's going to have interesting ripple effects, not only on their economy, but on economies that surround it, I think.
Yeah, the ripple effect is interesting. I keep going back to the fact that I think a lot of people now have a bit more respect for just the number and sheer breadth of things that we use natural gas for, and the ripple effect that not having enough natural gas can have on an economy. Plastic, glass, fertilizer, and everyone knows what happens next when fertilizer prices go higher.
Yes, that leads to some interesting and largely negative outcomes when that happens. So we will certainly keep our eye on that. Okay, Doug, back to you as you talk about the pause on LNG export terminals here in the United States.
Thanks, John. So taking one step back just to sort of understand how it works to permit a liquefied natural gas export facility in the U.S., there are many permits that you need, but kind of the 3 key ones that we think about are, first and foremost, a siting and operating permit from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that's FERC. They're right down the street from me here in Washington, D.C. That's a fairly straightforward permit to get. We haven't seen FERC, I don't think, ever reject one of those. The second permit that you need is from the Department of Energy, and it's called an export permit, or it's a permit to export liquefied natural gas to countries with whom the United States has a free trade agreement. And I'll get into that a bit more in a second. Under the Natural Gas Act, which is the statute dictating a lot of permitting for natural gas facilities around the country, DOE has no discretion in giving that permit. You apply for it, and it's automatically deemed in the public interest, and you get it. This is where it gets fuzzy, or difficult, rather. This third permit, the third key permit needed to build an LNG export facility in the U.S. is another permit from the Department of Energy that allows you to sell LNG to countries with whom the United States does not have free trade agreements. And the DOE has a lot of discretion in issuing those permits. It has to first make a public determination that issuing that permit and sending the LNG to these countries is indeed in the public interest. We have not seen DOE exercise that authority until very recently. There were a couple approvals in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we saw a long pause starting around the beginning of 2023. We called that the shadow pause because there wasn't actually a policy in place, but there were no approvals of several of the terminals that have been waiting in the queue for a long time. So what did end up happening in January of 2024 is that the White House and the Department of Energy announced that it was officially pausing its review of non-FTA, that's the permit to export LNG to countries with whom we don't have free trade agreements, those permits. So the DOE is going to undertake a long-term study on whether LNG exports are indeed still in the public interest. You know, we've reached 14 billion cubic feet per day. We've got another 13 or 14 under construction. But beyond that, the DOE wants to take a hard look at several things that are listed here at the bottom. So they're going to take into account what they believe global natural gas demand looks like going out. You know, as John mentioned, there's a lot of countries out there who are making ambitious decarbonization pushes. So the DOE wants to get a better handle on, well, what does global natural gas demand look like? They also want to take a look at what the impact of LNG exports is on the domestic market, specifically energy prices. So the price of natural gas, the price of electricity. They, of course, want to take a look at the climate impact of LNG, both from a carbon perspective, but also a methane perspective. And then the two final things are the impact of continuing to permit these facilities on environmental justice communities, especially in the Gulf Coast. And then finally, whether it still makes sense to send, or whether it makes sense to permit LNG exports to countries that are quote unquote hostile nations. And we've seen some chatter really on both sides of the aisle questioning the wisdom of sending LNG to certain countries around the world with whom we are openly competitive. So these are the 5 things that we're looking at. In our view, a lot of these questions have been asked and answered over the past 10 years. DOE has done extensive studies on all of these things and come to the same conclusion, which is that, yes, LNG exports continue to be in the public interest. But again, we do, it's an election year and things don't always come out. Things aren't always totally reasonable. So this is something that we're engaged on very heavily. And I did want to point out one thing. I think some people see a non-FTA export permit and think, well, how many countries do we really not have free trade agreements with? The answer is actually kind of surprising. So this is a map showing all the countries in the world. The countries that are highlighted in green are the countries with whom we do have free trade agreements. So it's actually a much smaller number than you might think. And another thing that should stick out to you is that no countries in Europe have free trade agreements with the US. And again, this is where a lot of our LNG has gone in recent years. So that's why that non-FTA permit is so important. It's essentially impossible to get your facility off the ground without that permit. It's difficult to get financing and difficult to find anyone to sign an offtake contract for that LNG. So just want to put this in perspective. And again, we've been talking a lot about the energy security benefits of both a strong domestic oil and gas industry, but also of a robust and well-supplied LNG market. I did want to point out that in addition to energy security, one of the things that we've seen over the past 18 years in this country is our carbon dioxide emissions in the power sector are down more than 1 billion tons. And the main reason for that is the switch from coal to natural gas in the power sector. So we have reduced our carbon emissions more than any other country on Earth, and it's not even close. 2/3 of that drop is, again, due to the shift from coal to natural gas. There are many countries, many regions of the world that are looking to replicate that exact success. I think, we talk about the energy transition, but in 2023, we burned more than 8 billion tons of coal worldwide. That's a record high. So while many countries are on the leading edge and have taken significant steps towards their climate goals, there are many parts of the world that are still relying on significant quantities of coal. And so we believe that getting more US LNG on the water can help those countries take a big step towards their own climate goals. And I just want to put this map up on the screen because I think it just tells a really simple story. So this is just a simple heat map showing the change in carbon dioxide emissions by country since 2005. So the greener the country, the more they've reduced their emissions. The redder the country, the more they've increased their emissions. And you can see in Asia why the problem is so acute. These are countries that have really industrialized. They've had rapidly growing populations nations over the last 2 decades, and they've needed more energy. Expanding middle classes demand more energy, and a lot of them have turned to coal because sometimes, in some cases, that's what they have domestically, but in many cases, they've been priced out of the global LNG market. So we really do see Asia as a critical piece. Asia's, getting LNG to Asia as a critical piece of solving this climate challenge that we face. So this is just one of my favorite maps to show because I think it paints such an interesting and clear picture for why LNG is so important, not just to energy security, but also to climate.
So, Rob, that is a fascinating map illustrating just, yes, the differences that you are describing here and the importance of LNG. I want to go back to your previous slide very quickly as we have a question from YouTube. This is from Tom. And the question is, what is the reason European countries don't have an FTA with the US? Does it have anything to do with climate change and green energy?
I know the answer to the second part of that question, which is no, it doesn't have to do with climate change and energy. I would have to check with our trade folks. The nuances of trade policy are something that are beyond my expertise with natural gas and LNG. But I can safely tell you that it doesn't have anything to do with questions over our energy or climate policy here in the U.S. But that's a good follow-up question, probably something that I should have the answer to ready.
Because it's interesting to look at this map. You've got South America, you've got countries of the Pacific Rim, you have a little bit in Africa and the Middle East, but nothing in Europe. That spot is blank, and that seems like it would be a natural trading partner for us. I'm just curious. I wonder if it has anything to do with the European Union and wanting to keep solidarity more regional. At this point, I'm just speculating, and I know you don't know the answer to it, but just some food for thought, I suppose.
Yeah, that's something that I will follow up with you on, John, because it's a good question. And I don't think this necessarily speaks to the volume of trade that does occur between countries. Obviously, we trade a lot with Europe and with many of these countries with whom we don't have free trade agreements. But it's just a kind of a quirk of how LNG permitting works that you need this special non-FTA permit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have another question here from YouTube. This is from Maurice. She asks, can the U.S. produce enough LNG and export it to make a difference in Asia?
That's a very good question. I think the market can decide that. I mentioned we export about 14 billion cubic feet per day now. These countries do have big populations, but they are not as energy intensive as the US. And I think our view is that every time you are displacing a ton of coal with LNG, you are taking a step towards your climate goals. And I think the fact that we're just seeing global coal demand rise so steadily, despite these climate pledges that are being made around the world, it just speaks to, well, even if we can't displace every ton of coal that's being consumed out there, that's likely never going to happen. Making incremental steps is progress, and that's what we're aiming for.
Something of a follow-up question in that same vein, I guess this one's from me, is we've seen in the US how natural gas works really hand in glove with renewable energy to ensure baseload power. You keep costs down, you keep reliability up. But does liquid natural gas vibe with renewable energy generation the same way that it does here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So typically what these countries that are importing LNG have is what's called a regasification terminal, and they plugs right into the LNG vessel. I should have included this on my first slide probably. And it basically turns the LNG back into natural gas that can be put into the nation's pipeline system, just like we use it here, and provide many of those same attributes that we benefit from. We know wind and solar are fantastic resources, and they have made a lot of contributions to emission reductions, but they are sometimes intermittent and difficult to plan for. So that's why we in the US and others have made investments in these fast start gas-fired power generators that can ramp up very quickly to complement and act as a partner with those renewable resources to ensure that not only do we get the emission reductions benefits, but we also maintain a reliable grid. And LNG will play a huge role in that.
Absolutely. When you start playing with reliability, people start to speak up, and that becomes a problem that you solve immediately.
Yes.
100%. Okay. Rob, I'll let you get back to your presentation. Thanks for indulging the questions.
No, absolutely. So jumping back to the US market, I know this is kind of the big question here is, all right, so we've got this pause. We know what the implications are for some of our partners and allies around the world. We know what the potential consequences are for emission reductions goals, but really, what are the consequences here in the US? So what I've done here is I just put a simple stacked bar chart that shows the change in natural gas use in the US cumulatively since 2011. So really what we think of as kind of the beginning of the shale revolution, when we figured out how to pull gas very efficiently from rock. And that technological innovation gave us energy security. It gave us these emission reductions that we've talked about. But so you can see how over the first decade or so of that 8 to 10 years of that of the shale revolution, the yellow bar there, the power sector, was really carrying growth in consumption of natural gas. So we were replacing a lot of our older, higher emitting coal-fired power plants with much lower emitting, more efficient natural gas plants, and that contributed to those emission reductions that we saw, that billion metric tons. But over the past 5 years or so, you see the light blue bar at the top, which is LNG exports. That's really been the driver of growth in consumption for natural gas. That's really taken the reins from the power sector in recent years. And that's really what's driving a lot of the investments that we see from producing members, including the entire country, including Utah. So what this pause in LNG permitting does is it sends a bit of a chill. If you're looking at the historical data and saying, wow, okay, really it's been these LNG export facilities that have been a big driver of growth, and suddenly their future is a bit murky. It's a bit unclear whether we'll be able to build more of these LNG export facilities. These are producers that are making long-term investments. They're not just looking at election cycles. They're making long-term investments based on the best available forecast that they have. So really what it does is it's another level of uncertainty for our industry here that really does impact how decisions are made, production, and not just production of natural gas, but also the infrastructure needed to move it from where it's produced to where it's consumed, whether that be in the power sector, the industrial sector, or at one of these export facilities. So that is really the main consequence that we see coming from this rule. But one other thing I wanted to point out was, the LNG permitting pause is just one of the challenges that our industry has faced over the last couple of years. And it's really on the demand side, but there's a lot of other regulatory challenges that we face. And this is what we call our headline grabbing regulatory challenges versus some of the below the radar sleepers. And again, this is just a very small sample. So I think what we've seen is just so much uncertainty injected into the planning and long-term decision-making that our member companies have to make that have just made it really difficult to make these investments. These are multi-billion-dollar investments needed to maintain a well-supplied domestic market, needed to maintain a well-supplied global market, and maintain affordable energy. So I think the number that I most recently heard from my boss is that we've engaged on something like 75 regulatory efforts in the past 12 months alone. So the administration has been keeping us very busy. But I just wanted to step back for a second and point out that, the LNG pause is a big issue, but it's just one of, many dozens of things that are making it difficult for our industry to operate. So just to wrap up, I always think this is an important slide.
Hold on, Doug. Rob, I keep calling you Doug. I'm sorry. I see the wrong name on my screen. And so you are Rob. I shall call you Rob from this point forward.
I appreciate it.
100%. My apologies for doing that to you. We know in this country, for a variety of reasons, just the layers of government that we have. It is difficult to permit things here, whether you're talking about an oil refinery or a uranium mine or even mining something like molybdenum. How much of this is unique to the Biden administration versus just how generally difficult it is to permit things in this country?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, the Democratic Party writ large is anti-fossil fuel energy. But really, even before the Biden administration, it's been very difficult for us to build an interstate pipeline in this country for a long time. We've got the big Marcellus Utica shale basin, which is our largest shale basin, the second largest in the world. And in the past 6 or 7 years, it's been basically impossible to build an interstate pipeline out of that region to serve what we know are markets that need more natural gas, especially like in the southeastern United States. There's similar issues out west. So it's not just unique to this administration. And honestly, a lot of the regulatory challenges for producers are even on the state side. So I do think there are larger challenges, and we've made permitting reform probably our number one priority for the past 2 or 3 years here at API, because we know demand for energy is growing. We see it in the electricity sector, it's growing, in the natural gas sector, it's growing, it's at a record high. And we have to be able to build these infrastructure projects. And right now, I think it's uniquely impacting the oil and gas industry. But just think about all the transmission lines that we're going to need to build to connect large wind farms in Iowa with population centers in Chicago. They're going to face the same challenges and hurdles that we've been facing in recent years. And again, that's why we think we need permitting reform and why it really should be a bipartisan priority.
You know, just today I was reading an article about nuclear power and the challenges that have plagued the industry here for the last 40 or so years. And one of the things that was brought up was the unique land footprint of solar and wind, which is much, much greater than it is for natural gas or than it is for nuclear. And there's a reckoning coming, because not only at the federal level, and this is just to underline the point that you made, this is not just at the federal level, but in states and in local communities, they have a say over how their land use is ultimately allocated and what it's used for. And so when you start talking about the size of a wind farm, communities are going, whoa, wait a minute, this is much larger and much more intense than I thought it was going to be. And so this to me speaks to your need and API's desire for permitting reform in terms of how do we maintain the quality of life that we've enjoyed for so long and permit the things that we need. And again, that's not just energy, but that's things like lithium, for instance. You know, we outsource a lot of this to countries across the world with poor environmental records and poor human rights records, yet we could be doing it here. And so how do we change the way that that's understood and the way that that's permitted?
Yeah, I mean, those are fantastic points. I think two things on that. One of the things that we've been watching closely is the Thacker Pass lithium mine, which is nearby. I can't remember. Is it Nevada? I think it's in Nevada.
I think it must be.
The regulatory challenges that thing is facing. I mean, it's literally being built to help fuel the energy transition, but it's still being challenged by a lot of folks who just really, I mean, our view is that they don't want to build anything. So that's the first point. The second thing is, to your point, you're right. If you look at a lot of these states and localities that have the most ambitious decarbonization goals, they're often places where you're not going to build a 500-acre wind farm. Think about New York City, New Jersey. You just don't have the space for that. So that, again, speaks to the need for these long-haul transmission lines to move the power from places where you do have some space to where it's being consumed. And again, that's another reason why we think we've got a good bipartisan argument for robust permitting reform here.
Absolutely. And if you've ever
silly season, it's election year, it's silly season.
If you've ever spent time in a city council meeting or a county commissioner meeting where they are proposing to add new transmission lines to a community, you will see people come out of the woodwork and give you the full complement of their feelings and emotions about that project, regardless of how needed it is, regardless of how benign it is. People will show up to express their displeasure with you putting new transmission lines through their community. It is really a sight to behold.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
A couple more questions for you.
Sure.
One is, is there any future in natural gas powered vehicles? Many US cities have public transportation like buses that run on natural gas or are natural gas hybrids. You also see that from companies like UPS. A lot of their fleet vehicles are CNG powered. Sometimes you'll see cab companies powered by propane. What do you see as the future for natural gas and vehicles here in this country or in other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's another question that would be great for our downstream folks to answer. I think, I've observed the same thing that you have, which is that it's generally like the municipal fleets, buses, et cetera, that have opted for the CNG, the compressed natural gas vehicles, that hasn't really made it. And in other countries, decidedly, my wife is Argentine, so we spend a lot of time in Argentina, and every taxi cab has a propane tank or CNG tank in the trunk that they run on. That hasn't made it here yet. So I don't have a view on what the outlook for natural gas is. I think right now, especially the Biden administration's view is that electric vehicles are that's the path forward. They issued their final tailpipe rule a month or two ago that would require about 2/3 of all vehicles sold by 2032 to be EVs. So that's the path forward that they've identified. But again, we think consumers should have choice as to what types of vehicles they want to buy and operate. And if that's natural gas, then they should be able to do that.
Understood. Another question we have from YouTube is, what would be the short-term and long-term effects on U.S. industries that rely heavily on natural gas? How does this pause impact them in terms of just U.S. industries that are natural gas intensive?
Yeah, that's a good point. We have to be a bit careful talking about like the future competitiveness of industries that use natural gas, because we're a trade association, of course, like you guys are, and we have antitrust concerns. But I think, thinking back to my last slide where LNG has really been the big driver of growth over the past 5 years, just having that uncertainty around the future of that industry, people want to invest in things that are growing. So if you put some doubt into the growth of the industry, that's not good from an investment perspective. So that's something that we're keeping a close eye on. I think, the flip side of that, one of the things that the Department of Energy is looking at during this pause is whether there is a negative impact on consumers of continuing to export LNG. And it's actually a nice segue just into my final slide. We are the largest producer of natural gas, both the largest producer of natural gas in the world and the largest exporter of LNG. And our residential natural gas prices are among the lowest in the world. So I think what our industry has showed, and again, this is a question that we think has been answered many times, is that we can maintain a well-supplied domestic market while growing our LNG imports, especially if production is allowed to grow and we're allowed to build infrastructure. So I think both sides of this question are just about equally as important here.
I agreed. And, that's one question that comes up a lot in the dialogue surrounding natural gas exports is, why doesn't LNG exports, or why don't LNG exports drive up costs domestically? A lot of people will assume that if we are exporting our natural gas, then our costs are going to go up. Historically, that has not proven true. Can you provide a good answer to how the economics of that work?
Yeah, I think the reason is that we have a very, very robust industry that has never failed to rise to the challenge of growing demand. So our LNG industry here in the U.S. was really born in early 2016. That's when the Sabine Pass export facility came online in Louisiana and began exporting cargoes. Since then, the export capacity has grown to about 14 billion cubic feet per day. During that same period, natural gas production in the U.S. has grown more than double that amount, so about 31 billion cubic feet per day. So really what that means is that consumers in the U.S. are not competing with LNG exporters for the same molecule because we've got enough to go around. So again, that just speaks to how important it is to have a flexible and unencumbered oil and gas production industry that is where we have reasonable policy, sensible energy policy.
This is a question from YouTube as well, and this might be a little more granular than you can specify, but does this pause on LNG export facilities have any specific financial impacts to Utah?
Yeah, it's difficult to tie an export facility. Again, the export facilities that are tied up in this pause are in Louisiana and Texas. So, but as we know, it's one giant interconnected system that we have here in the U.S. Our pipeline system is a national pipeline system. So I think you have to revert back to the uncertainty that this brings to the investment in the upstream. And I know I keep coming back to that, but that's really kind of the big question mark here is, if we aren't continuing to grow our demand for natural gas via exports, via the power sector, again, remember, we have all of these other regulations coming down the pipe as well, so to speak. That is really where you could see parts of the country that you may not immediately think of as, LNG hotspots be impacted. And again, I hesitate to go deeper than that.
Yeah, understood. Kind of what you're describing, it reminds me of a butterfly flaps its wings in Singapore, you get rain in Central Park, right? So depending on some of these seemingly unrelated things or things that are much further down the supply chain, you never know what the full impact is going to be because there are so many issues at play. That's what I hear you describing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Fair enough. Do you have a sense for when the pause is expected to end or change? Because it is advertised as a pause. It is presented as we need some time to do some studies, most of which your organization is of the opinion of. These studies have been asked and answered. Do you have a sense for when an end date for this might be in view?
Yeah, so the administration has given a couple answers on that. I think they've initially said by the end of this year, and then more recently revised that out to the first quarter of 2025. I think it's still a bit up in the air. I mean, this is a big comprehensive study that they're undertaking. But, I did mention this is an election year, and I can almost guarantee you that the pause will not be up before November 7th. So that's, I think, really the only deadline that we can be certain of.
That seems to make sense to me. Okay, Rob, back to you.
No, and that's all I have. So I'd like to turn it right back to you, John, to take any lingering questions that you may have or that the group may have.
Absolutely. So here's another one that we have. What do you see as the potential changes or shifts in trade relationships with countries reliant on U.S. LNG? Where do they seek alternatives if we can't continue to meet their demand? How does that affect our overall trade policies with them? Is that something that you can comment on?
Yeah, a bit. I think that's a big risk here is that, like I said, there are people out there who they see their energy demand. When I say people, I mean there are nations around the world who know that their energy demand is growing, know that they're going to need liquefied natural gas to meet it. And they see this regulatory uncertainty in the US, especially around the permitting pause. And, it wouldn't be unreasonable for them to look at some other suppliers of LNG. And we have seen about a month and a half ago, Qatar, who is now the second largest exporter of LNG, made a big announcement that they're going to build a huge expansion at one of their export facilities right now. And the timing of that was not lost on anybody. So while we're here fighting a regulatory battle and pushing for what we believe are the well-established benefits of LNG, there are other countries that really do see an opportunity, and that's a risk for us.
Absolutely. When you showed the map of where LNG export facilities are, obviously they're centered around the Gulf Coast, but I also saw a few facilities in Canada and in Mexico. What are the logistics challenges or likelihoods that some of this export activity shifts to the countries that are immediately to the north and to the south of us?
That's a really good question. So the regulatory environment in Canada is also challenging. Many would probably say it's more challenging than what we have here in the U.S. So I think there's less risk that Canada is going to view a big economic opportunity here. And then the interesting point about Mexico is that I think all of the maybe N-1 of the facilities being planned in Mexico, some of which are under construction, are actually sourcing U.S. natural gas. So they are bringing in pipeline gas from the Permian Basin into Mexico, liquefying it, and then exporting it. Interestingly, those projects are also subject to this non-FTA permit from the Department of Energy. And there's actually, in addition to the 4 projects in the US that are subject to the pause, there are 2 Mexican projects that are also subject to the pause. So there's a bit less risk in ceding market share to our North American neighbors. But just overall, I mean, there are other countries out there who would like to grow their exports.
One of the things that we like to do at UPA is we like to strike a note of optimism. So what gives you hope? What gives you what makes you optimistic as you look forward in this industry in LNG exports, which in my mind and in UPA's opinion have been good for Utah, they've been good for the United States, and they've been good for the world. As you look forward, what gives you hope? What gives you optimism in this space?
I think, man, that's a really good way to end. I think if there's one thing that both our industry and the US have shown is that we're resilient. You don't have to go that far back, 2007, 2008, to find when people actually thought the US was on the cusp of being the largest LNG importer in the world. And then what happened? We figured out how to pull shale from rock. Shale gas from rock, and suddenly our fortunes were totally shifted 180 degrees. We are now very much in control of our own destiny as the largest producer of natural gas in the world, the largest exporter of LNG, and really we've become a cornerstone of global energy security. So I think the fact that we've always been resilient, both as a country, but also as an industry, gives me hope.
I think that's always gives me hope. One of the things that we talk about at UPA is we are a nation and an industry of problem solvers.
Mhm.
So as we view the world, we say, okay, well, this is how it's going to be. How do we adjust? How do we change? How do we evolve? How do we make this better? How do we continue to deliver the products that people need in the face of any regulatory hurdles or uncertainty? And so I share in your optimism with that in particular.
No, thanks.
So on that note, I don't see any other questions from YouTube. Ricky, I'd like to throw it back to you. If you have any closing remarks, any questions, anything at all, I think we can bring this home.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks, Rob. That was really, really interesting and well articulated across a broad range of issues. I particularly loved your slide with the headline grabbers and the below the radar landscape. You know, you mentioned that API has engaged in more than 75 regulatory efforts in just the last 12 months. That's profound, and we feel it here at the state level as well. You know, I sometimes hear from stakeholders asking why we don't do more to defend our industry. And I think that perhaps there just isn't a recognition of how much we are actually under attack and how much we are actually doing at local, regional, and national levels as well, on a lot of those below the headline issues. And as you said, you know, that level of regulatory change makes it so very difficult for companies to make responsible long-term plans that support the necessary long-term investments to continue to provide the American energy we need here at home and abroad. And so I think that applies when we're talking about generating enough electrons, regardless of where they're coming from, whether that's fossil-based or renewable-based, when we're talking about, you know, the transmission that's going to be needed to move those electrons, when we're talking about the pipelines to move natural gas across the country and to get it to export markets. We're going to continue to need to provide much more power than what we have been with the electrification of everything and the surge in data centers. And that's going to need to have baseload power as a critical component to it. And that doesn't even get into, as you started with at the beginning, all of the products that are going to continue to be built from natural gas and exports to support the US and to support our allies. And so, you know, trying to wrap it all back together, again, you did a great job, but I just really hope that our political leadership approaches our energy policy, and particularly this pause on natural gas exports, with eyes wide open. You know, Rob, as you alluded to, it's an election year, so it's certainly silly season. But if and when we come back to reality, you know, I think that we should be confident that a lot of the questions the administration is asking have indeed already been asked and answered, with the resounding conclusion that natural gas exports are a net benefit to the US. And we have a very real model to look at how this works when we look at Europe over the last few years, as you talked about at the beginning. Natural gas prices are higher, power prices are higher, and that has real implications in terms of deindustrialization, just to start with. And we're starting to see some of that play out, and that can have real ripple effects, not just on those countries' economies, but really globally in terms of, you know, how the manufacture of plastics and glass and fertilizer and the pricing of everything related really plays out as those production centers move and shift. And we start to see what happens geopolitically with that. So the question of, can we keep US natural gas prices low while also growing our exports? I think that we would agree that answer is yes, if we can continue to grow production and have adequate infrastructure growth. And that really comes back to the regulatory landscape, both at a federal level and a local level. So a lot of implications there. And just to follow up on one of the questions asked about implications to Utah, my personal opinion would be that if we dampen the ability to export products, we constrict the market. If we constrict the market, we're talking about a smaller market, and you end up with supply-demand imbalance. As the price goes down because of that imbalance, production goes down, and you'll start to see that production drop in places like the Western US, including Utah, where, you know, the cost to produce is more challenging, the regulatory burdens are more challenging. You're going to see production drop there before you're going to see it drop in some other areas. So while indirect and we are not, physically directly connected to export facilities, I do think that we're going to see some of the domino effects of a prolonged export pause or challenges in export ability, even here in Utah. But I do want to end on an optimistic note, as John said, and I would completely agree and echo with what both of you said. Despite some of the policy and political challenges, I am confident that our resiliency will continue to win out. So I hope that was an okay summary of a lot of what you covered, a pretty big topic, and really appreciate you joining us and touching on all of that today. And on that note, I think we'll wrap it up, and we'll see everyone back here next month, where we're going to have a discussion again about some of these BLM policies, the federal policies, and some tips and tools of what we can do to really navigate through them as we work to continue to provide reliable fuels for the U.S. and our allies. So thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you, Rob. Greatly appreciated it.
Thanks, Ricky. I appreciate it.
Bye.